Hi everybody, and welcome back to my channel. Today I think we're going to talk about Chrysler Infiniti, and more specifically we're going to try out the rarest of my Chrysler Infiniti stereos, and we're going to see if it still works. You are looking at it right now. It is the very, very first Chrysler Infiniti deck that they ever made. And even rarer than that, it's the silver-faced version. This unit was only available in 1987 on the Chrysler New Yorker. At the time, there were only 3 vehicles where you could get a Chrysler Infiniti system. One was the New Yorker, one was the Lancer, and one was the LeBaron. And yeah, finding these in silver face, good luck to you. I gotta say, it took me years to find this one. And when I got it, it was broken. And we'll talk about that more as the video goes on. But for now, let's just bask in the 80s glory here. You've got analog EQ sliders, which seem to be a little sticky these days, but whatever. Analog everything on this unit. It's about as 80s as you can get, pretty much, without going to maybe, say, Toyota and some of their Fujitsu 10 stuff. And fun fact, if you've never heard of Fujitsu 10, maybe you've heard of Eclipse. That was their high-end consumer electronics brand, Eclipse was. But yeah, Fujitsu 10 is no longer in the market as far as aftermarket audio stuff, so... But that's neither here nor there. We're not here to talk about that. We're here to talk about these Chrysler Infiniti tape decks. And we'll get into some of the speakers as well while we're into this video. And yeah, so here's how this came about for Chrysler. Back in the mid-80s, they saw what Bose was doing in terms of getting into the aftermarket, or not into the aftermarket, into factory audio systems, and they decided they wanted a piece of that. So what they did was they contacted Harman, and you know them now as Harman International, or a subsidiary of Samsung, but back then they were just Harman. And Harman was thinking about getting into the factory audio game. So what they did was they partnered with a couple of different companies. They went in with Chrysler for these Infiniti systems, and then they also went into Ford with the JBL audio systems. That's right, folks. JBL, Infiniti, Mark Levinson, Harman Kardon, all of these brands are under their Harman name. In fact, they're probably about either the biggest or the second biggest supplier of factory audio systems, or factory premium audio systems, I should say. I cannot talk today. Anyway, at the time, Chrysler had been making their own car stereos for quite some time. They came out of the Chrysler Huntsville electronics plant, along with their digital dashes and other digital electronics. But they wanted something a little more high-end than that. So around about 1985 or so, they introduced the Ultimate Sound cassette deck. And I happen to have one of those units right here. Actually, let me set them up next to each other so you can sort of see a little better what I'm talking about. I'll zoom out a bit. Anyhow, this is an Ultimate Sound deck here, this black one. In fact, it is the parts unit for the Infiniti version next to it. Anyhow, Chrysler wasn't satisfied with their own car stereos at the time, so what they did was they contracted a longtime supplier of theirs. And you might know about this, but back in the 80s, Chrysler had a thing going with Mitsubishi, or Mr. Squishy as I like to call him. You might remember this, but in the 80s, Chrysler had this cooperation with Mitsubishi. Dang, I want to say Mr. Squishy all the time now. So maybe I will. They had this partnership with them where they exchanged vehicles, parts, like engines, and they even went down to car stereos. And this partnership lasted a really long time for the car stereos, I gotta tell you. So yeah, both of these decks are made by Mr. Squishy. And if you ask me, they're some of the best cassette decks, or factory audio cassette decks you could get in the 80s. I don't know of any that did any better, except maybe the aforementioned Fujitsu 10 decks they did with Toyota. But Mitsubishi did a great job with these, and in fact, Mitsubishi kept going all the way through the 80s, all the way through the 90s, and all the way into the 2000s for Chrysler. And you might be asking yourself how you can tell a Mitsubishi deck apart from anything else. Well, let me get this up here for you so you can see the label. And I will zoom in even more if I can. There we go. Okay, so you see this supplier code here? 28046? That is Mitsubishi right there. And they used some other brands as well. They had Clarion in terms of building car stereos for their dealer option packages. That's where you find the Clarion stuff. And I don't know the supplier code for Clarion. I'm going to tell you right now. Now, in terms of the Huntsville Electronics decks that Chrysler built themselves, you would look for a supplier code of 7910. And in the 90s, they contracted with Alpine for their first CD players. Well, I shouldn't say that. Their first CD players were also Mr. Squishy. Their single dash, or I can't talk again. Their single disc add-ons to these were Mr. Squishy, and you would look for that supplier code there too. But in terms of Alpine, their very first in-dash, let me reframe that. Their very first in-dash CD units were from Alpine, so they called those the Infinity 4, which is kind of weird, but there you go. Yes, there was an Infinity 1, 2, and 3, and I don't have any of those decks in front of you right now because, for one thing, I didn't keep any of the Infinity 1 decks. The Infinity 2 decks are extremely problematic. They're all built by Mr. Squishy again, but they're computerized and they're even more complicated than these are. And I have never been able to keep an Infinity 2 working. The Infinity 3 I have 2 of. They're still on the shelf. We're not talking about those today because they're early 90s units, and they're pretty good as well, but like I said, we're here for these units. Now this black-faced unit here is the Ultimate Sound deck. This came into production around 1985 or so. In 1986 they were offered. And when it came time to partner up with Harman for their very first Infinity units, let me switch out again. What they decided to do was go back to the Ultimate Sound deck as a basis for it. But in fact, I'm going to stack these, or try to, just so you can see better. Okay, there are some big differences between these two units, and one is sliding off the other, which is not what I want, but yeah. These are actually two different models. The top unit, the Ultimate Sound deck, is the RX650B, and the bottom unit is the RX671S. And you got B or S depending on whether or not you got silver face or black face. There is a blackface version of this bottom deck, and it is much more common than this one is, but I don't have one because both decks are rare. The blackfaced unit was used up until very early 1988. In fact, my parents bought a 1988 Grand Voyager LE that had the blackface version of this. We got that van in, let's see, I think about 1990-ish. We did this big classical organ installation in Edmonton. My parents bought a van on the way back, and it had the very first Chrysler Infinity system I had ever heard at the time. So, yeah, there are some major differences between these two, and if I can get them set up here so that they aren't sliding off of each other, I'll tell you what they are. First of all, you see on this deck there is an SRC on or off. That stands for stereo reception control. What that does is on the FM band only, it forces the tuner into monophonic mode. So yeah, basically it's a mono stereo switch for the FM to help bring in distant stations better. Down here, you do not have that control. You have AM stereo on or off. Now I believe both of these can do AM stereo, but only the bottom one has a defeat switch for that. Otherwise, most of it's the same. You do have dynamic noise reduction on here versus Dolby noise reduction down here. But yeah, that's really kind of a minor detail there. So let me try and set this up a little better again. I will zoom out again. I will reset the camera again. So yeah, today what we're going to do is just see if this works. Now this does not work anymore. Or rather, it probably works, but it's missing parts. And that has a lot to do with this one. See, when I got this one, I got it off eBay. I don't know exactly when I got it. It would have been early 2000s or so. I had been looking for these for years and hadn't been finding them. Then suddenly this one popped up, and it said shipping only to the United States. So I took a chance and I emailed the seller and I asked them if they would consider shipping to Canada, and fortunately the answer was yes. So I paid about $50 to get this one. And unfortunately, when it showed up, it had problems. In fact, it had serious problems. Now, in terms of Mitsubishi Chrysler decks from the 80s and 90s, they all have one thing in common. They all have bad solder joints throughout the whole unit. So if you buy one of these, I guarantee you right now, you will be going through it and resoldering every single circuit board. It doesn't matter how old or new it is, you will have to do that. Even up to the mid-90s CD cassette combo decks that Mitsubishi made, and they made a lot of those. Those are now coming down with bad solder joints, so just get ready right now. Mitsubishi was plagued with solder joint issues back then. And as far as I know, they never really got on top of that problem. So the Alpine units do have solder issues as well, but not as bad. In terms of the Alpine units, the single CD slot loading ones from the early 90s, most common problems with them are displays that go out. And usually that's because there's a big surface mount resistor inside that gets hot and burns up the solder joint over time and makes it let go. So yeah, most common problem with those are displays that don't work. But in terms of Mitsubishi, yeah, there's just going to be bad solders all throughout the unit. And this went even further than that. This one had an amp chip that didn't work. They used 4 amp chips, one for each speaker output, and one of them was dead. So what I did was, I got into my Ultimate Sound Deck here and I took one of the amp chips out. So yeah, that's why that one doesn't work anymore. So, with that being said, how about we shut the camera off real quick. I'll get this set up to run and we'll just see what works on it and what doesn't. Because I went through it completely years ago, but I don't know how well it works now. So let's do that. Alright, so we've got power to the unit now, and we've got power to my little FM modulator over there, and we're just going to see what works and what doesn't. But before we do that, I forgot to put something in there for an antenna, so I will stick one of my little mini screwdrivers in the back for that. And today we are also going to be checking out the abstract audio speakers we got in the thrift store video. I'm anxious to see if those work, so that I've got them hooked up to the to the rear speaker outputs on this unit. So we're going to see if those work. And just in case you're wondering, that Steinberg USB audio interface, from what I can tell, is fully working. I cannot believe I found that, even still. So yeah, I have big plans for that Steinberg unit. I'm going to probably try and get a decent microphone for it so I can do voiceover work with for A, future thrifting videos, and B, my author reading videos. Because right now the Rode Wireless Go is just not making me happy. So yeah, the Wireless Go sounds terrible for voiceover work. I don't want to use it for that. I want to use something decent. So anyway, we've got power clearly. Got a nice bright can't talk again. Got a nice bright vacuum fluorescent display up there, so let's turn her on and see what happens here. We've got sound on AM through both of these abstract speakers. See if we can get an AM station on this. We'll try the local one. Hope I don't get a copyright strike. And yes, it is there, so AM works. Okay. Now I'll pause for a second. Okay, I think we're ready to go with FM here. Turn that up so we can hear it again. Looks like we are already getting a signal here. So that should be working. Now I just wanted to mention, you might be curious about this little control here. AMB or ambience. What this does is it affects the FM stereo only. It's sort of meant to make you think you're in a concert hall, so I don't know exactly what it does, but yeah, it does something like that. But we do seem to have an FM stereo signal here, so let me start some music. We'll see if we can get it going. And yes. I can see I'm going to have to get in here and clean this control again, and I apologize that this isn't in stereo, but it is very clearly in stereo for me. But again, Rode Wireless Go, what are you going to do? I can only do mono with this microphone. The EQ does seem to be working. Wow, sounds great, honestly. And yes, you can even use the noise reduction on FM stereo. I don't know why you would, but it's there. Now before we get to the cassette, there's a little trick I want to tell you about with this. You can actually defeat the clock. Let me see if I can set it up so you can see what I'm doing here. Now the procedure to do this is only valid for this unit and the Ultimate Sound Deck I showed you earlier. You press the set button, volume knob, and then the 70 microsecond twice. And there you go, no more clock. I can turn it off and no display. That's because the clock is defeated. But as far as I know, this is the only deck where that works. And there, we got the clock back. Okay, so what are we going to do for a cassette? Considering I don't want a copyright strike. Well, we're going to do this guy, David Gibson. I will be very shocked if I get a copyright strike on this cassette. So, let's see if we get a tape deck working here. And it does still appear to be fully functional. We'll just let it play here. Now you're never going to get perfect sound quality out of these kinds of auto reverse decks, because the heads they use in these have to accommodate all 4 channels present on the tape. They don't have a flippy head type thing for these. So you're only going to get so good of audio quality out of them. But as you can clearly hear, this thing's working. She's reversing properly as well. And to eject, we just hit that button. And there you go. Clearly it's still working just fine after all these years. Albeit with some scratchy controls that I need to go in and clean again. So what's my plan for this deck? Is it for sale? No, it is not for sale. It will never be for sale. Honestly, it took me so much time to get my hands on one of these that there's just no possible way I'm willing to sell it. In fact, I'm looking for another one. I want a blackface one. Just because those are my memories. Learning to drive in my parents' '88 Grand Voyager, rocking out to KLF, and whatever I could get my hands on back in the day, Pet Shop Boys, whatever. I've just got so many memories with that blackface unit that I want another one of those, just to go with this one. But as far as this one goes, I may try to get my hands on a mid to late 80s Chrysler vehicle again, that this would look good in. Most likely I would want an 87 or 88 New Yorker Turbo, because that's what these came in. But these would probably look good in a LeBaron as well, but I don't know. What I would really love to get my hands on is a mid-80s laser. And I could just see this deck fitting in real well with that, but the blackface version of that would be probably better. Let's just say it that way. So, I'm going to shut this off now. And we're going to talk Chrysler Infinity speakers for a little bit here. And it's great to hear that working after so much time. Obviously, I don't listen to it very often anymore, but it's just great that it still works. Anyway, I've got a couple of Chrysler Infinity speakers here we'll talk about. Now, like I mentioned, 1987 was the magic year for Chrysler and Infinity. That's when it all started. And it only started in 3 vehicles. There was the LeBaron, the New Yorker, and the Lancer. Those were the only 3. They would move to other vehicles in 1988, like the Grand Voyager I mentioned. But in 87, you only had the 3 models. And this speaker here, this is a 5x7. This is from a Daytona, or for a Daytona. It's new old stock. We've got this soft dome tweeter in the middle. And we've got the usual woofer. And turning it over, we've got this little module on the back. This is the amplifier for the woofer. The tweeters in the systems were all powered by the head unit directly back in the day. So there's a little crossover inside here that you can't see. It's just a basic capacitor, and that feeds the tweeter directly from the head unit. These amplifiers, these are booster amps that power the woofer directly. Now this one doesn't work. I actually had 3 of these. I sold this one and one just like it to somebody who reported that this one didn't work once he got it out of the box. So what happened was I took the other one, the third one, the odd man out, and sent him that one, which was also for a Daytona, but it was newer. It had a much bigger magnet than this one has. And that was the Achilles heel of these early Chrysler Infinity systems. They had this tiny little magnet for the woofer, powered by 20 watts out of this amplifier, and they couldn't really make bass that well. But fortunately they beefed all that stuff up in 1988 or so, and you got much better quality. Now, which is the best of the best when it comes to the Chrysler Infinity speakers? Well, that comes down to 2 years, 88 and 89. See, back then, in those 2 years, I don't know if you can see it, but those were the only 2 years you got actual Infinity emit tweeters in these things, like this one has. And this is the rarest of the rare when it comes to the Chrysler Infinity speakers, and we'll get into that shortly. But yeah, 88 and 89, that's the only year you could find emit tweeters in the system. And you had to go to 2 vehicles specifically to get emit tweeters. You had to get a minivan with the Infinity system, or you had to get a LeBaron convertible. And those were the only 2 models you could get the emit tweeters with. All the other ones used these soft dome tweeters, which blew easy. The emit tweeters don't blow as easy, but the reason why they're so rare is because they are crossed over very, very high, something like 5 kilohertz. So there really isn't much of an operating range on these tweeters, but when they get going, good Lord, do they sound good. So yeah, like I said, my parents bought that 88 Grand Voyager, and it had speakers with the emit tweeters, but it had these style of amps on them. So yeah, not much bass, but those are very, very common to find. They're the most common to find possible with these emit tweeters. In fact, they're so common, I have 22 of those things used in my home theater right now. Believe it or not. I just love those little ribbon tweeters so much that I just wanted to use them in my home theater, and so I did. Now, what makes this particular speaker rare is because of this. Look how big that magnet is. And it's got a bigger voice coil to go with it. We got an inch wide voice coil in that thing, compared to ½ inch for this one. And as you can see, the amplifier is a sort of semicircle module that's wrapped around the side. It's got the same 20 watt output, but yeah, because the magnet's bigger and because the voice coil's bigger, these sound a lot better. They were found in only one model in one application, and that's the LeBaron convertible in the back. The front speakers use those little soft dome tweeters, so forget those. In the back, you got these wonderful emit tweeters with a nice big beefy voice coil and motor and a nice amp to go with them. So yeah, they had to do it that way because they needed to get as much bass as possible out of this little 5 1/4 inch driver. So yeah, if you've got a LeBaron convertible in 88 and 89, save your rear speakers. Trust me, you will never find those again if you get rid of them. In fact, I've only had 3 pairs of these, ever. And I sold 1 pair, and I kept the other 2 pairs. And one of the pairs is currently being used as the center channel of my home theater. So, yeah. I've got a full Atmos setup, being powered entirely by Chrysler Infinity emit tweeters. Crazy, right? Anyhow, I think that's about all I wanted to talk about with you guys today. Not sure what's coming up next week. Either that's going to be my first author reading video, or it's going to be another project of some type. I don't know what to do for a project yet, but yeah. I just love everything on this table here. Don't ask me why. Nostalgia, let's call it. And yeah, this new old stock speaker coming out of the box dead was not very pleasant, but it is what it is. I've still got a bunch of other Chrysler Infinity stuff and Chrysler audio stuff hanging around, so maybe I'll do some more videos on that stuff, but for now, I guess that's going to be it. Take care all. See you next time.